Hi there. We're back with another episode of Garner Station. I'm Rick Mercier. This is a Town of Garner production, and we're happy to have with us here today Greg Richardson, a Garner resident, and
That's right.
also the executive director of the North Carolina Commission of Indian Affairs. And Greg, it's great to have you here.
Thank you,
for
Rick.
taking some time out of your busy
Yes,
schedule to
indeed.
join us.
Glad to do it.
So you are, as we said, the executive director of the North Carolina Commission of Indian Affairs, and I'm sure a lot of folks don't know about that entity, that agency, and what it does. Can you describe it for us?
We are a division within the North Carolina Department of Administration. The Department of Administration is a state agency. And so we're housed there. And so as far as our staffing and administration of programs, all that work filters through the Department of Administration's systems, whether it be accounting, whether it be hiring employees, policy issues that we work on, those kind of things fall within the umbrella of the Department of Administration. Our commission is made up of 21 Indian members and 5 state officials. The Indian members are appointed by their tribe and their organization. And those 5 state officials serve on the commission by virtue of their position within state government. So the Secretary of the Department of Administration sits on our commission. The Secretary of Commerce, for example, is on our commission. So the reason the structure is there like that is so that we can get advice and input from state agencies on the work of the Commission of Indian Affairs. Our commission administers a number of programs that get to the needs of or address the needs of American Indians, such as workforce development. We need trained workforce in our communities. Indian economic development, our people seeking jobs and trying to expand their businesses and those kind of things. And we have issues like domestic violence in the American Indian community, just like other populations do. So through those 3 examples of programs, we have some resources available to address the needs of our American Indian communities.
Okay. And how did this agency come into being? How long has it been around, and kind of what was the impetus for it?
Right. Well, it's historic in that the Commission of Indian Affairs was established right after the Civil Rights era of the 60s. So American Indians came into being in terms of having a seat at the policymaking table, if you wish, back in 1971. So tribal leaders went to Raleigh, came to Raleigh and met with members of the General Assembly and said, we need an entity to address issues relating to our communities and our population. So that discussion was motivational as far as the legislature. So it was a strong partnership between our tribes and members of the General Assembly to establish the Commission of Indian Affairs. So through that process, the commission was established, and after that was, of course, the development of our programs and provision of services for the American Indian population.
Was there much pushback?
I don't recall. Of course, that was before my time. I was quite younger. Yeah. But don't recall any major pushback as far as the creation of the Commission of Indian Affairs. I do recall the pushback in terms of the funding for the commission. It's one thing to put it on the books as an entity, as a state department within state government or division within state government, but then comes the funding. You have to have the resources to get the work done. So started out with a very small budget, and then, of course, it evolved over the years. It really didn't come into being as programming until about 1974, 75, that particular state fiscal year. And I came over from Vietnam in 1972, so our chief, W.R. Richardson, at that time, was informing me about the creation of the Commission of Indian Affairs and that he wanted me to be a part of that. So he was a person who you couldn't say no to. And so I said, yes, sir, I'll consider that. I was working in banking at the time in Rocky Mount. And so the commission started receiving its first funding in 74, 75. And Chief called me and he says, I want to see you. And so I stopped by his house one weekend, and he told me about the funding that the commission had applied for and had received, and he handed me a state application. And he said, you fill this out and get it back to me tomorrow, which I did.
And so that was your beginning.
Kind of the beginning of it.
And what was your job? It sounds like it was probably I don't know. It seemed maybe a little bit scary. You had a job in banking, and maybe that was pretty secure.
Yeah.
Suddenly, you're being asked to do this. So, what was the
And
position you took?
moving from home, my security,
which
at
was
home.
at the time that was Rocky Mountain.
Told my dad about it, and my dad's very conservative, and he thought, well, I said, Dad, I've got an opportunity to go to work in Raleigh, and he says, you've got a good job. You're working in a bank. None of our people have ever worked in the banking system. People's Bank, it was called then. And he says, I don't understand why you'd be leaving. You go to work dressed in a suit and tie. You've got a good network there. You're making good money. I said, oh, but I do have a good network there, but it's not good money. So I told him what I'd be making when I'd start to work with the state. And he said, okay, you take that job, which was $10,000 a year starting out. So I started out as basically a technician, employee in the workforce and training program. A lot of us that started out in Indian Affairs back then and has moved forward now, we kind of cut our teeth on that workforce program because it provided us with an opportunity to get a job with state or an agency. And through that, you got some experience under your belt. You started creating a resume so that you could compete for jobs. And so I came on board in 1975 in that program and kind of worked my way up from where I started because it was an entry-level position, very entry-level. And incidentally, I didn't have a degree at that point. So I was going to school on a GI Bill and continued to do that until I got my BS degree, and stayed with the commission for 14 years, and then left after the Indian Housing Authority was created, and the Indian Housing Authority was looking for a housing director, so they recruited me down to Fayetteville to work at the Indian Housing Authority. Had reservations about leaving the commission at that time because, I'm a state employee, and I've worked my way up in that system, and do I really want to leave and go to work for a quasi nonprofit? So that kind of, was wearing on me. But I did make the move, and it proved to be a good move. I stayed there right at 4 years, and then the next stop was in Washington, D.C., with an appointment at the U.S. Department of Housing and Urban Development. Okay. So then I stayed there until 95, and our previous director was retiring here at the Indian Commission. So I said, wow, I didn't go to Washington, D.C. to stay, and, came back and fortunately was selected as director of the Commission of Indian Affairs in January of 1995. So entry level, working well up a little bit, left, came back as director in 1995.
Yeah. Can you tell us about some of the programming that the commission provides or offers?
Always enjoy talking about the programming. Workforce program, as I mentioned, provides an opportunity for someone to go into skills training. So skills training can be obtained through community college. So if, like my situation, I didn't go into community college, but I was going to school working on my degree and on a different path. But the same principle applied. Stayed with that. I worked in the job training program, the very job training that provided skill training. I was an employee in that. So completed the education. So from that, we can look around the state. A lot of the leaders that are my age and some younger, that's where they started out, because that program provided an opportunity to get training and skills that you would not normally be able to get into. So today, the program still exists. The name has changed several times because of changes in federal legislation, but the program basically is the same. So we can put a young person right out of high school into the program as a nursing assistant or nurse, automobile mechanic, electrician, heating and air, plumbing, and that individual can get those skills with some assistance through our program. So what we do is we pay a portion of the tuition and some stipend to help them travel to and from work, that kind of thing, to and from class, that is. So, and then, another program, of course, is housing. Two areas that were high priority for us as the Indian Commission was employment and housing and education, three areas. Housing, I mentioned, I went to work with the Indian Housing Authority, and that was the first start of housing development in Indian communities with 204 HUD-funded units, apartments. And then the education component, we've always set as a priority as far as education. So we had in that same cycle that I started in, a talent search program that worked with our students to help keep them in school, keep them making the right grades, and plan a career path after they graduate to move on either to community college or to a university or college campus. And unfortunately, that funding for us has ran its cycle, and we're working now to build that back because we really need a program that kind of grabs onto those youth, those students, to help them find their way to their career path.
So you said, maybe it's before we started rolling, that there are now 8 state-recognized tribes in North Carolina. I guess they span the length and width, breadth of the state.
Right. Mostly in the eastern part of the state. And if we had a map, if you can imagine Interstate 95 north-south coming through North Carolina, the majority of our tribes teeter back and forth along that corridor. And people say, well, how did the tribes end up in that geographic area? Well, there's a lot of theories behind that because, the settlers landed on the coast. And so Indians might have, moved further inland to escape, to be safe. And so that's one theory. But the other theory is that the good Lord put us there, so that's where we are, And, these communities are somewhat in areas where, farming would be a challenge. So the land in these communities, another theory is that we're not very sought after by the settlers. And so therefore, we were left alone. So in my community, Hallowasaponi, extremely wooded area. They called it the Meadows at that time. If we moved to the Lumbee area of Robertson County, extremely low-lying, a lot of swamp area. Also, Waccamaw-Suans would be in the same area of swampy, low-lying areas. So therefore, Indian people were allowed to remain in those areas because they were not sought after land, where major farming operations could take place. And it's very obvious. I mean, you can go to my community and drive 30 minutes or less east, and you're in very nice sandy soil that you can almost scoop your hand into and dig it up. Mm-hmm. Well, in my community, you won't do that. You're going to have a shovel. Yeah.
Where did you grow up? What was your community? And can you tell us a little bit about that?
Sure. Grew up in Halifax County in the Hallowasaponi Indian community, which is about 60 miles from where we're sitting. And it was a small farming area. We could do some farming, but very limited because of the terrain and because of the soil. And the community is split by a county line, Halifax County on one side, Warren County on the other side. So if we look at the census data, about half of us live in Halifax County, about half of us live in the other. So after the Civil Rights era also, or I would say preceding the Civil Rights era, in some areas of our state, there were 3 school systems. So you had the white school, of course, you had the Negro or black school, and then you had the American Indian school. And so in the Hallowasaponi community, you have that. In Coharie, you had that. In Lumbee, you had that. In Waccamaw-Suan, you had it. Very distinct Indian schools that were in these areas. And that's also a unique history in that for most of these schools, the teachers came from the Lumbee community, Robertson County, because they had Pembroke Indian Normal School. So they were training teachers. So after the teachers were trained, they needed some place to teach. And so they were recruited and started teaching in these other communities. So all of my teachers came from the Lumbee community. Leela Jane Clark was my first grade teacher. The Wide Awake Indian School down in Waccamaw, Siwan, pretty much the same thing. Teachers came from Robertson County. They lived in our communities. Parents provided them a place to stay during the week. They would go home on Friday afternoon, come back on Sunday afternoon to teach right there in the community. So our parents built the schools and paid the teachers until about 1967. And that's when another change occurred where you couldn't have segregation was abolished. So the Indian schools fell within that category as well. So that we didn't have an Indian school anymore. We went to the public school. So in 1967, I went from Hollowa to Aurelian Springs and became part of the public school system. And so it started out a little rough, needless to say, but over time, everything came together. And I have friends that I went to school with back at that time that I still communicate with. Yeah. So in the community, farming was one opportunity for the parents. Most, though, had to work other jobs because the farm was not enough to sustain. So in the Hollowa community, Lumbee community in particular as well, you have a lot of male heads of household who fell into or gravitated to construction trades. And the reason for that is if you ran a farm, you worked on a farm, you could do anything. You could build a building, put the roof on, work on the equipment. And so when you went out to work a construction job, you had multiple skills that you could apply on those jobs. And for that reason, American Indians were recruited far and wide. In my community, my dad worked in Baltimore, in Washington, D.C., during the period when they were building the first high-rises in Washington, D.C. The Lumbee community for years and years and years have been known for their sheetrock finishers, the men who would go into these buildings after they're built and put up the sheetrock and finish it and all that. There were truckloads and van loads of Lumbees traveling from Robertson County and even some cases now to Raleigh and Charlotte and places like that to continue that work. Hollowa has changed. We don't see that many of our male heads of households now moving out of state to seek work. We think that that's because there's more opportunities now in our Indian communities than we had back in the 60s.
And you mentioned there are urban Indian organizations.
Right, and to complete
what are those?
Right, yeah. Your first question was about the 8 Indian tribes.
Yeah.
So on the commission, there are 8 tribes and there are 4 urban associations. And that's kind of unique to North Carolina in that we have urban associations on our commission sitting alongside the tribal leaders. They basically have the same power, same vote on our Indian commission. In other states, you'll find that only tribes sit at that table. But the authors of our legislation felt that the urban Indian communities should have a voice in policy making for American Indians in our state, which is very unique.
Is the thinking because you have people leaving their, I guess, more traditional communities, coming to urban areas, and they're a little more uprooted? I mean, their experiences are just very different from people who are
key word there's experience.
Yeah.
So you know throughout history you know about the Removal Act, right, where American Indians were formally removed from their communities and placed on a reservation somewhere else, like the Trail of Tears with the Cherokee. Well, for state-recognized Indians, the same kind of thing happened, but it was not a forced type of transition by the government. It was a transition for economic opportunity. So you have in North Carolina Indian people who moved from our communities, from Hollowa to Greensboro, Lumbee in Robertson County, Scotland Hope in those 4 county area, Greensboro, Charlotte, Fayetteville, for jobs and educational opportunities. We have some very successful American Indians all over the state, but in these rural areas, in these urban areas, we have some very successful Indian people who moved and relocated to make sure that their family had better opportunities, that they had better job opportunities and economic development opportunities. So we feel like North Carolina could be really, as far as the Indian story goes, it could be a really unique story to tell about North Carolina Indians. And Rick, I really appreciate the opportunity for you all and Garner to provide me with this and us with this opportunity to have this discussion. Because one of the things out here now is that people do not have the opportunity to learn about history like we once did. People don't have the opportunity to be engaged with other people with different cultures. And so having podcasts like this and events like this helps people to get a better understanding. So the urban communities are not tribes. They do not have the same authority. They do not, in terms of governance. So in the governance situation, tribes are sovereign. And I know the word sovereignty is a little bit debatable sometimes. And sovereignty sometimes mean different things for different people. But what we know is that whether the tribe is state or federally recognized tribes, tribes have the authority to, number one, determine their own destiny in terms of programs and services for their people. They can determine their own membership criteria, and that's a standard all over the nation, no matter whether it's for a federally recognized tribe or a state recognized tribe. So one of the common calls that I would get at the Indian Commission is that someone who's not been able to get their tribal enrollment card, they would call me and try to get some advice in terms of how to figure that out. And sometimes, we can help them, sometimes we cannot, because we cannot issue a tribal card. I get people calling me who've been to the tribe, they've been to their tribal council members and only hit a brick wall. And that's because in most cases, their genealogy is not totally intact. Maybe no fault of their own. It could be a history type situation where the genealogy just broke down and they don't have all the records, old family archive records. Like in the non-Indian community, we can go to archives and pull back volumes of genealogy and history on population. We can go to pull up old birth certificates. But what if there was no birth certificate for you or your children? You kind of hit a dead end. So sometimes we can help. I usually start with, well, where was your parents born? Where was your grandparents born? And then the question is, have you been back to look at the archives from where they were born? Birth records in the city or the county that they were born. For the grandparents, great-grandparents, your mother and your father. Well, if you can walk it down that trail and pull the information together, that is going to really benefit you in terms of, having a discussion with the tribe about your tribal enrollment. Going to the tribe without that information, it's not much that the tribe can do because they have rules that they have to go by in terms of the tribal enrollment. So in North Carolina, you have eight state recognized tribes, and you have fully recognized the Eastern Band of Cherokee, no doubt. But then you have the Lumbee, who is quasi federally recognized because of the Lumbee Act of 1956, in which Congress, with one stroke of the pen, said you were recognized, but didn't afford any services, didn't provide any services for the Lumbee. So they can't operate a casino. They do not have Indian Health Service and a multitude of other programs that you cannot access if you do not have federal recognition. So that's always a question that comes up. What is the difference between state recognition and federal recognition? Right. So it's about services. It's about authority to be able to conduct certain types of programming within the community. So now emerging in North Carolina is another unique situation in that the Catawba now has an operation in North Carolina, which has just happened in recent years by virtue of them placing land, part of their homeland, which is surrounding the city of Charlotte, Mecklenburg County, into trust with the federal government. So they have land there now, it's in trust to the federal government, which is part of their reservation. And as part of them being federally recognized, they have been able to open a casino there. So there are those things that have to be in place. So oftentimes people will ask, well, what are the dynamics going to look like now that you've got another fully federally recognized tribe in the state? Well, we don't know. But we are working with the Catawba. They'll be attending our upcoming commission meeting, and they seem to have an interest in working with our state Commission of Indian Affairs.
You might need to explain for some of us what a tribal enrollment card is and why it's so important. It's not just a matter of symbolic value. It has real value.
Kind of give you a really good example here of the Halawasa Pony tribal enrollment card, and so in a sense, out here we kind of talk about this as a card-carrying Indian. Card-carrying Indians.
Yeah.
That means you have a card that a tribal government has sanctioned and said that you're a member. And but all Indian people don't pursue their tribal enrollment cards. I have family and friends who are bloodline with me that do not have a tribal enrollment card. And some of that is by choice, but sometimes it's because their parents didn't take an action. So if my parents hadn't taken action when they did to become enrolled in the Halawasa Pony tribe, then it would have been a bigger challenge for me to get an enrollment card. Because first I got to prove, number one, that I got to prove who my parents were. And then I got to also try to figure out and come up with some documentation as to why they didn't get a tribal enrollment card. So it's kind of a situation like what we refer to in law, a chain of events. If the chain is broken and great-great-grandparents didn't get a tribal enrollment card, it makes it next to impossible for the next generation to get a tribal enrollment card. So with all that, you have a generation now that's cut out of any services that one might be able to get in terms of scholarships, access to these programs that I've mentioned, because we have something called Indian set-aside programs, which kind of offends some people, but that's done on purpose through Congress, in that Congress has determined that, like, the workforce program is needed because this American Indian population was such disadvantaged that they didn't have the opportunities that some other people. So with that tribal enrollment card, you can get access to the workforce program.
And we also talked a little bit before we started rolling about the challenges in just collecting accurate data about Indian people. So can you talk about some of that? I mean, is some of that just tied up in folks not having their Indian enrollment cards, or other ways, or they choose not to self-identify maybe?
You have a lot of all that.
Yeah.
Some people choose not to be identified with any racial category. That's their choice. But then you have government operations and agencies who collect data, but seem to have a lukewarm process to make sure that the race-based data is accurate. So if Greg Richardson were to go to Wake Med right now and was admitted in the emergency room, Greg Richardson might be, because of my skin tone, might be logged in as Hispanic or Italian or some other race, no race at all. So then what happens to all my tests, that's given to me to figure out what in the world's going on with Greg Richardson? Is it because his diabetes level has reached a certain point where he's passed out and non-functional? So the data becomes very important to us as a small population, because without good data, we can't prove the true incidences of diabetes within our population. What we can get is some degree of incidences. So we know whether it's a state-recognized tribal member or a federally recognized tribal member throughout the United States, diabetes is severely impacting our population. So when you look at it from the federally recognized Indian side of the aisle, then they get good data because they have the Indian Health Service system and Indian hospitals. Greg Richardson and Hallowasaponi, Lumbee, and the rest of us who go through the public system, we have to depend on the public system to, tabulate that data and collect that data. And oftentimes it's a challenge because it's looked at as a burden. Why do we need this data? Well, we need it because it's impacting our health, So, and then on top of that, we're sending all kinds of data to CDC, another entity that's going to evaluate us as a population. So if CDC is getting flawed data about American Indians, then, the outcome from that research is going to be flawed.
Let's turn to culture and language, and all throughout the world. Indigenous peoples and their languages are being lost. I think at it really keep accelerating rate. From what I understand, is this something that you work on? The commission focuses on preserving culture and language, and especially engaging young people in that.
I would say that our tribes are doing the bulk of that work. Hallowasaponi, we have a language program. Lumbee has some very fantastic processes moving forward with the younger people who are teaching old language. Eastern Band of Cherokee have the Kadua School, where every student in the class today has to speak Cherokee. So from the littlest to the oldest teacher, everybody there has to speak the language. Even the parents coming up to pick up the student this afternoon at the front of the school, they have to call in. And when they call in to pick up their child, that message has to be in their language. So yes, there's a huge emergence going on all over the place in terms of going back and not recreating, but finding semblances of the languages, getting it written down, getting it to the point where it's being spoken. So it's been a slow process, but there is an entity that is housed within the federal system, Administration for Native Americans out of Washington, D.C. And so they have funded some grants for some of the tribes in North Carolina to do just that work that you're talking about, do the research, find the elders who were the speakers and get those words, get some spellings of words, and then, the process can start to elevate when you have a starting point. So it's not something that's easy to get funding for, and some of the grants that we've seen in North Carolina that went to the tribes have already gone away. My tribe, for example, we don't have that funding anymore, so that project is on hold. But the good thing about it is that we did get some work done, and so hopefully in the future we'll be able to pick that work back up, right? But what is emerging and really strong all over the state and the nation is the cultural aspect of our population. Starting in the spring, there's going to be a powwow all over the state in different communities throughout November. Downtown Raleigh, we just had a huge Indian Heritage Month celebration with huge numbers turning out just to have that experience, to meet an American Indian, to see some artwork being made right there in front of them, beadwork, stonework being carvings being done right there in the museum right downtown. So that's really becoming a really strong process for all of our communities, and a lot of youth are really picking that up in a strong way. So that goes hand in hand with the language. You got the cultural aspect and the language. So all of it's really coming together really strong in our state.
It's great to hear. We could talk for a long time. I don't want to keep you here too long, and we want to keep the show within certain constraints. But there are other challenges. Are there other things that we should know about that we haven't touched on? I'm sure there are.
There are always challenges, but I'd like to say something on where we are as a population in our state, and through Governor Cooper and his administration. Right now, we have more American Indians that's been appointed to state government boards and commissions and councils and employed than ever in the history of the state of North Carolina. That speaks volumes. So prior to that, we had a lot of people talking about cultural diversity. We had a lot of people saying those words, but when you look around, we're the American Indians. So we're seeing a distinct difference in our state now because of where we are and what we see with this administration, and I've been in this business for a few moons, as we say, but this is absolutely incredible to have this happening and have secretary of our own Department of Administration, Secretary Pam Cashwell, she's Coharie Lumbee. And that's really, impressive dynamics because her mother, when I started to work at the Commission of Indian Affairs, her mother was working there with us. So I knew her personally. And the secretary was just a little, girl running around behind her mother. Improvements in terms of business opportunities. We have some incredibly smart American Indians who are doing some dynamic work in our state. In the area of development, Comtech out of Robeson County. You can look around here in Robeson County, in Raleigh rather, and they've fulfilled contracts on a lot of these huge buildings downtown Raleigh. They built a complex for Catawba Health Center, and currently doing a lot of work in Charlotte in terms of construction. That's good because as they grow and develop, they're hiring more people. People got more jobs. Healthcare, we've got some really dynamic people working in the healthcare field right now. Dr. Robin Cummins retired, heart surgeon, now, chancellor at the University of North Carolina, Pembroke. Speaks volumes for our state to have American Indians holding positions like this. In other states that I deal with, staff with other commissions, they hear about what's going on in North Carolina and they look at us with awe. And how do you all do this? Well, it's partnerships and working with people. In some states, there's a huge disconnect between tribes and state government. In fact, they have battles. And you could look at some of the things that's going on in the western states with water now because water's drying up. So Navajo, for example, just huge problem with water, but there didn't seem to be any efforts going on at the state level to help them resolve that issue. And because they're federally recognized, the states tend to look back and say, well, that's a federal responsibility. It's not a state issue because they're federally recognized. But they're citizens of the state, right? So we have, we just finished the 2020 census, and every 10 years you get a census, and that's always something that's been an interest for me in recent years, not, as getting into this business earlier, because I thought the census business was pretty boring, working with numbers and everything.
But when you
look at the numbers, it's the policy behind the numbers that really drives me now, because you've got North Carolina has the largest American Indian population east of the Mississippi. We have 130,000 American Indians in this state that track along the line of Indian alone, the numbers, 132 plus. And then if you look at another column, which is really interesting with census, is that we have almost 850 plus thousand American Indians who are American Indian in combination with other populations, which is a huge difference between 2010 and 2020. Another distinct difference in the census is that we are seeing a migration of American Indians from rural communities to urban communities, and that's also evidenced by other populations. So if you look at rural eastern North Carolina and small towns, they lost population. In urban areas like Raleigh and Durham, gain population. So that will present some new challenges for us.
We talked about the difficulty in collecting good data. Do you feel like the 2020 census data were pretty accurate as far as Native American populations?
We're never really truly satisfied with the data because well, we look at it as undercount. That's the technical term I was looking for. So every decade, you can find evidence of an undercount, where an Indian community was not fully counted, or the numbers should have been higher than they are. We're seeing some of that with the 2020 census. But there's a lot of factors in 2020 that you see that impacted that with COVID, and then census did away with their major effort on census advisory committees, which also impacted, I think, and that's Greg Richardson's opinion, because in 2010 and 2000, we had distinct committees at the federal level that tracked along populations. So you had an American Indian Advisory Committee on 2020 census, 2000 and 2010. You didn't have that for 2020. So what the feds did is consolidated all those committees together, and they had one or two Indians sitting on the panel, on the committee, rather than a whole committee dedicated to sit in a room and say, well, what are the challenges with our communities? And we're different in Navajo than we are in Robeson County, North Carolina, in Cherokee, North Carolina, Hiawassee. There are different dynamics that impact those numbers. So you really need to have input from the communities in order to have effective policy. That's the way to do it.
So with that, I think we're going to wrap it up. Okay. And it's been great having you. And thank you for sharing with us.
Thank you for having me.
I know I've learned a lot, and I hope our listeners and viewers have as well. And so that's going to wrap up this episode of Garner Station. You can watch this episode, other past episodes on our YouTube channel, and the audio is up there on all the podcast platforms. So check out this episode and share it with others. Subscribe to the podcast, and we'll see you next time. Take care.